Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the Made of Millions YouTube channel. If you're a return visitor, you know that this is my second live series with Made of Millions. If this is your very first time here, welcome. And thank you for joining me on episode 1 of Positive Psychology. So this is going to be another 5-part episode. On positive psychology this time. The first live series was connected to the idea of digital wellness and 5 particular aspects of digital wellness that I find to be really, really important. So if that is a topic that you're interested in, you can have a look at the Made of Millions YouTube channel here, and you will be able to find all 5 of those videos here. Hi, Charlene. If you're joining us, guys, feel free to say hello in the comment section. It's really great to see you here again. So, like I said, the topic of this particular 5-part series is going to be positive psychology. Part of my background as a psychotherapist and a psychologist is in positive psychology, and I use positive psychology practices a lot when I work with my clients, whether I'm working with people one-on-one, or if I'm working with a group in more of a kind of workshop or a talk setting. And I think positive psychology really has provided us with a huge wealth of resources, of really daily practices, of very small things that we can do in, I like to call them the micro moments of our lives. And so this 5-part series is really going to be talking about that. In today's session, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the kind of overarching ideas of positive psychology. I chose to name this episode Going Rogue because that really is what the field of positive psychology actually did. And you'll understand why very soon. So this first episode is going to be an introduction. I'm going to share some of the major principles of positive psychology with you. And then towards the end, I'm going to share a list of resources with you of books that I really feel you should read, websites that you should visit as well. And if you would like any additional resources, then of course, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll be sure to share some more of them with you. So let's get started. If I could summarize positive psychology in just one slide, in just one picture, then this would probably be it. And this is a cartoonist I really encourage you to follow. His name is The Awkward Yeti, and he does this one series around the heart and the brain, kind of showing how they're pulled in very different directions. And I think this picture illustrates that really, really well. So you see the heart looking at all that is good with a little butterfly perched on top. And then the brain, on the other hand, you see is really paying attention, very, very close attention to what is bad. And it's saying to the heart, now heart, can't you see that I'm busy? And this to me exemplifies positive psychology, because I think what it really encourages us to do is to try and not only look at what is bad, because that is very easy for us to do. Our brain is wired towards something called the negativity bias. We just have that tendency to pick out all the things that are either dangerous or negative in our environment. It's a coping mechanism, and we should be very thankful for it. But really, positive psychology kind of gives us another option. It kind of gives us another direction in which we can look, and that is to look at the things that are good or that are going well around us. So I really love this picture for that reason. I think it illustrates that point really, really well. If you've, again, been with me before, if you've watched some of my other episodes, you know that I like to use cartoons from the New Yorker a lot. I think they just do such an amazing job of representing the simplest and the most abstract events in everyday life. This is a really wonderful example of what psychotherapy still looks like to a certain extent, but really how it started out. And so the therapist here says to Humpty Dumpty, eventually, I'd like to see you able to put yourself back together again. And the reason why I wanted to pick out this quote is because I wanted to kind of lay the ground for you so that you can understand what exactly meant that positive psychology went rogue. This statement here, of course, begs the question of what is broken and what is wrong, and what needs to be fixed, what needs to be repaired, what needs to be put back together again. And that is what psychology and the field of psychotherapy used to primarily focus on in the very early days. And the questions that we ask each other, that we ask ourselves, are incredibly important. And this is one quote from Tony Robbins that I always try to keep in the back of my mind, just in my own personal life for my own sake, but when I work with my clients too. And that is that the quality of your life depends on the quality of questions that you ask. And so if you think about this, the previous slide, and this asking of what is wrong or what is broken or what needs to be fixed, it kind of leaves you in that position that we saw from the first cartoon, where the brain is only looking at what is bad. Or what is negative, what is difficult, what is dangerous. Whereas if you can tweak that question a little bit, you will direct your focus into a very, very different direction. And again, that's exactly what positive psychology did. But if we kind of go back to some of the earlier days, and that's if I could get my tech to work. There we go. This is probably a familiar figure for those of you who are not familiar with this man. He is considered to be the very founder, the originator of psychotherapy, and he's the father of psychoanalysis. It's Dr. Sigmund Freud, who was born in Vienna and practiced there and developed a lot of his theories there. Dr. Freud was actually taught and educated in a traditionally medical field, so he was a neurologist, and a lot of psychotherapists came from that field. They were concerned with the brain, and a lot of the times they assumed, or they anticipated, that psychologically, when things kind of went wrong with us, it was usually due to something physically being wrong with the brain. And because they were seeing a lot of these kind of very frightening and very unusual behaviors in a lot of people, we're talking about some of the more serious disorders such as schizophrenia, things like hallucinations and so on. They were fascinated by this. And so, of course, their focus was on the very dark, the very deep, and the very disturbed, because it just completely perplexed them, and they had no ways of explaining what was going on. And so the field very much started with that kind of a tone, really looking at what was deeply wrong, what was broken with people, what needed to be fixed, and what needed to be repaired. And so if you were being taught and trained to be a psychologist or a psychotherapist, a lot of the time you did look at that, we call it the disease model. So looking at the psyche of a human being through what is wrong with it, and the ways in which things kind of go off the rails at some point. This man, in case you're not familiar with him, is called Dr. Martin Seligman, and he is considered to be one of the fathers, definitely the founding father of the positive psychology field. And Dr. Seligman was taught in very much the kind of similar way, going through undergraduate school, graduate school, really focusing again on mental health disorders, disabilities, ways to repair them. He did a lot of research on that, did a lot of research within the field of depression, and he is very well known for his experiments on learned helplessness, which, if you're interested in depression and in kind of behaviors around depression, I would really encourage you to look those experiments up. But Dr. Martin Seligman, what he basically did was, at one point, he asked the question of, why are we asking questions about what is wrong and what is broken and what needs to be repaired? Why don't we turn our focus around a little bit and maybe ask slightly different questions? So why don't we ask questions about what is going well, or what is right? Or why don't we look at people who seem to be reporting pretty high levels of mental and physical health, well-being, who seem to have a pretty satisfying life, who seem to have pretty healthy relationships? Why don't we look at those people and try to kind of investigate what is right with them and what is going really well? And then let's take it a step further, and let's try and teach other people about how to employ some of these behaviors, some of these attitudes, whatever these perceptions are that these people have, that that make their kind of their daily lives so different, as opposed to other people who don't report very high levels of well-being. So the difference there, you can see, is really, really stark. And it comes down to a lot of things. But for me, one of the basic things it comes down to really is the question that we're asked. So that difference between asking what is wrong with me, and asking what is right with me, or what am I already doing quite well, or taking it even a step further and asking what am I grateful for today, which going to be talking about in a little bit, because gratitude has been a really, really kind of fertile ground for research in the field of positive psychology. So, as you can see there, and as you can probably guess, the very big difference is that for Dr. Martin Seligman and many of his colleagues in this field of positive psychology, their approach was very much strengths-based, happiness-focused, and very optimistic, very optimism-focused. Which, again, if you think back to Sigmund Freud and the way the training in psychology and psychotherapy typically went, it's very bizarre. It is highly bizarre to suggest that you want to focus on the happiness of your client, or the happiness of people in general. But this is what positive psychology actually did. So it is that really huge key between these two questions, and again, what it comes down to really is where your attention goes. And we sometimes say wherever your attention goes, energy flows. And so that means that you're going to be investing a lot more energy, a lot more attention into what is already going well in your life, which of course then is going to impact the way you feel about yourself, about the people around you, about your life in general. And then, of course, as you can imagine, extrapolating from that, your relationships are going to be a lot healthier. And this is what a lot of the research in positive psychology has shown so far. So I want to share with you now some of the kind of key gifts of positive psychology, or the treasures of positive psychology, as I like to call them as well, throughout this series. So we're going to have 4 more episodes. I'm going to be picking out a few of these, such as optimism and resilience, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about them. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the different techniques and tips and behaviors and attitudes that you can implement in your own life in order to really amplify these for yourself. So, like I've been saying from the start, a change in focus is probably the biggest gift that positive psychology has given us. It has given us this opportunity to focus on something different and to ask different questions. So that's really huge. It is very strengths focused, and you'll see that one of the resources that I share with you is the VIA Character Strength Survey, which I would really encourage everybody take. Positive psychology has very much been focused on what your innate strengths are, and what are some of the ways in which we can explore these, what are some of the ways in which we can kind of bring these up to your awareness, so that you can actually actively and intentionally and purposefully use them in your everyday life. And again, the results have been very, very impressive. And I think at this point, something like over 11 million people have taken the VIA Character Strength Survey. And of course, the more people take it, the more robust and strong the test itself also becomes, and the more accurate it becomes. So I definitely encourage you to go and take it. A focus on positive emotional states, and not just a focus on them, but really a discovery of what are some of the most positive emotional states that we can occupy as human beings. So this research has been done by Martin Seligman and a lot of his colleagues. Again, you'll see in the resources that I share with you information about the Greater Good Science Center, which is at the University of California in Berkeley. And they've done extensive research on a lot of these positive emotional states, the state of awe in particular. And so we have this focus on gratitude, on kindness, on compassion, and self-compassion as well in particular, and awe as well. And the reason why that's important is that once we understand these states a little bit better, we can then understand how to enter them, again, in a very intentional, very on purpose kind of a way, so that we don't just wait for things to happen to us so that we can be grateful for them. We actually find ways to be grateful on purpose, as I like to call it. Optimism has been a really big focus of Dr. Seligman's work in particular. Again, one of the books I'll be sharing with you as a resource is focused on optimism. And he's done a lot of work, again, around exploring what optimism means, what its components are, what it's made up of, so that we can then follow some of these pathways into greater optimism. And I will be talking about optimism in one of my other episodes, so I don't want to spend too much time on it right now, but typically optimism is conceptualized as these rose-tinted glasses and kind of looking at the world as a wonderful place, even though it isn't, a little bit like that first cartoon that I shared with you. That's not really what optimism is about, though. So I encourage you to come back and find out more about that in one of my later episodes. The growth mindset is something that educators, in particular teachers, are probably going to be familiar with. Dr. Carol Dweck at Stanford has been doing a lot of research on this, and it's incredibly important, not just for children in that educational setting, but for us adults as well. We tend to get very stuck in our ways, and we feel that if we're not able to do something, or we don't know how to do something right now in this moment, we won't be able to do it, ever. There's that slight bit of kind of catastrophizing. And what the growth mindset has done is, again, explore the difference between being in those two states, the fixed state and the growth state, looking at children in particular and looking at how they differ. The children who do have that very fixed way of looking at their abilities, and the children who are a little bit more open and a little bit more inviting to uncomfortable settings, to being outside the box, to being asked questions that they don't necessarily know the answers to immediately. And one of the most helpful things that's come out of that is a tiny little 3-letter word, and that is the word yet. That is something that you can add on to your kind of negative thoughts or your negative self-talk, and really change your whole perspective around it. So again, looking at an example from the educational setting, if you're not very good at math, you can say, I'm not good at math, and then add the word yet. And this is something that I always recommend parents do with their children, because of course we do see that a lot with children when they run into difficulty, when they're not able to solve a math problem or read a particular piece of text. They can sometimes get down on themselves and have that very, very fixed mindset. Just adding that word yet really opens up the door into the future, really. And it opens up the door to the possibility of actually being at least a little bit good at that particular activity somewhere down the line. But what it also does is really motivates you to get there. So the growth mindset is hugely important. Resilience is something that we've been talking about a lot, especially since the beginning of this year with everything that's been going on. And again, I'll be talking a little bit more about resilience in one of the future episodes. This is a topic that I do trainings and workshops on quite often. And again, I think it's very important for us to understand what resilience is actually made out of, so that we can understand what are the best kind of pathways to learning resilience. It is a very dynamic thing. It's not something that you just do once and then you've learned it and then you suddenly become resilient. And one thing I always like to say to my clients when I do workshops with them on this topic is that, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you're not going to learn how to be resilient while you're sitting with me here and listening to me talk about this and doing this workshop, even though we have some activities around resilience. We learn resilience from being out in life, in the real world, and dealing with hardship, dealing with failure, dealing with challenges, having to cope, having to figure things out. And so one thing I've been saying a lot to parents in particular, and to kids right now during this period of physical distancing and quarantine, is that you are learning resilience right now. In case you were wondering when that was going to happen, it's happening to you right now. It's happening on a daily basis. And I think that's something that we all need to give ourselves a big pat on the back for. Definitely. Purpose and values. Positive psychology is very big on understanding purpose and values, and people finding their purpose, being really in tune with their values. The research has found that people who do report very high levels of well-being, of happiness, tend to be pretty clear on kind of meaning, on the purpose of their life, of the things that they do, of their relationships. They're very much connected to their values, and they really live pretty much, every day of their life in tune and in alignment with their values. So purpose and values is a really big thing. And as you would know, if you saw my previous series, one of the areas of specialization for me is digital wellness. And so when I work with families, or when I deliver workshops to parents around how best to help children learn to use technology in very mindful, again, intentional, purposeful ways, I always recommend that the family really think about what their values are, just in other areas of life, whether it's to do with food, whether it's to do with relationships, with behavior, whatever else it is, and really use that as a guiding principle to then how we kind of show up as digital citizens, and how we use and consume technology as well. Emotional balance is another really, really important one because, again, similar to optimism, the field of positive psychology is sometimes looked at as this field that really expects of you as a human being to be happy all the time and to be in that kind of positive emotional state constantly. And that is not really what it's about. It really is more about emotional balance. So the way I always like to conceptualize it is that on the one hand, it is about trying to amplify some of those positive emotional states, trying to connect with them a lot more, trying to really enter those states in a very intentional, in a very kind of conscious and purposeful way, to understand what are the things that help you experience gratitude and show kindness and be compassionate and experience that state of awe and joy and excitement and so many other ones. But on the other hand, it's also about being aware of what the rest of our kind of emotional landscape looks like as well. So that if there are, less comfortable emotions and heavier emotions such as sadness or fear, anxiety, disgust, any of the ones that we typically refer to as negative emotions, although I don't personally like to do that, that we are aware of them, that we don't just sweep them under the rug, that we kind of find a place for them in a space in which we can really hold them. And learn how to sit with them, really, which actually feeds into our ability to be resilient. So I did a TEDx talk a couple of years ago on the topic of emo diversity, which is just one of the areas of emotional intelligence that really talks about emotional balance and what are the best ways of us being emotionally balanced. Finally, I think one of the most important aspects of our gifts of positive psychology, maybe only second to this change in focus, although I think it's connected to it, is power, is the fact that positive psychology really gives us a huge amount of power to take control over our lives and our emotional landscape and how we feel, what our mood is like on a daily basis. If you think back to kind of the early stages of psychotherapy and psychology, back to the times of Dr. Sigmund Freud and many decades after that, it was really the therapist who had the power and the knowledge and the authority to help you, to tell you this is right and this is wrong. You're not doing this very well. You need to be doing this. You need to be doing less of this, and you need to be doing more of that. And this is how I think that you should proceed in order to feel better, in order to be healthy. We still, of course, do have that within psychotherapy. When you go see a therapist, of course, they are an authority of sorts, but they're really more there to guide you. And for therapists who use positive psychology practices, that is absolutely the whole kind of point of the exercise, is really for the therapist to just be a kind of guide there and to really help you understand all of these different elements of your psyche, again, of your emotional landscape, and to really help you build all of these up. And usually the way in will be through your strengths. So really understanding what they are, and then really empowering you to build up the kind of life that you actually want, which again isn't going to mean that you're going to be happy every single day. Right now it is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so I would encourage all of you to kind of read up more about mental health issues and to learn a little bit more about mental health disorders. But one of the mental health disorders that I always like to mention when I talk about positive psychology is what we call mania, and that is a state of very intense, very, we could say, excessive positive emotion. So I like to kind of illustrate that as kind of too much happiness, and the fact that too much of anything is not good. Our body's not built to spend longer periods of time in any one particular high energy state. And so the same is true of kind of happiness and joy and ecstasy and emotions like that. The idea really is to empower you so that you can find some balance in your life, and try and find that overall balance as much as you can, even if you don't find it kind of on a daily basis. But again, I'll be going into a lot more detail about some of these different aspects of positive psychology in my further episodes here. So this is a very, very short list of researchers and books that I really want to draw your attention to, that have spent years researching positive psychology practices, people who seem to report very high levels of well-being, and they've been doing an incredible job of sharing all of this information with all of us so that we can start implementing some of these practices in our own lives. So Sonia Lubomirsky, who's based out in California, is somebody who I reference all the time in my work. She's written these two fantastic books, The Myths of Happiness and The How of Happiness. They're very, very easy to read, and they're just full of really, really useful practical tips and a lot of research written in a very accessible kind of a way, right? So not in a kind of stuffy academic sort of a way. So her books I always recommend. The Optimistic Child by Martin Seligman. Even if you aren't necessarily a parent, I recommend that to adults as well, because he talks about optimism in a really wonderful way. Flow is another really, really popular book, and I always try to stay away from trying to pronounce Mihali's last name, because it is exceptionally difficult and I don't want to butcher it. But that's considered to be one of the most important books in the field of positive psychology. The Happiness Advantage, you may have seen Sean's TED Talk, which is absolutely incredible. I think it's probably one of the most seen TED Talks. I would encourage you to have a look at it. Barbara Friedrichsen, who's done a lot of research on positivity, Ilona Boniwell, Carol Dweck, who I've mentioned before, and then a kind of staple of the positive psychology field, even though it definitely wasn't written as a positive psychology book. It was written by psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, called Man's Search for Meaning, which is a very, very small book, incredibly powerful and full of incredibly significant events from his life, thoughts that he had while he was in a concentration camp. Just a very, very moving book. And he talks about meaning a lot, which of course is very central to the field of positive psychology. I wanted to put in a novel for you as well, Hector and the Search for Happiness. It has now been made into film. I would suggest you read the book first, though, before you see the movie. It's a really lovely book that talks about happiness in, again, a very, very accessible and a humorous kind of way as well. The VA Character Strength Survey I mentioned before. This was developed by Peterson and Seligman with a lot of other contributors over the years. If you go over there and you take the test, you'll see that you will get results that consist of 24 character strengths. And oftentimes what we do when we coach people using positive psychology practices is that we look at those top 5 character strengths, and we look at the ways in which you can use these strengths on a daily basis when you're feeling fine, but also in those moments when you feel like you maybe need a little bit more help if you're feeling particularly anxious or down on any given day. And then finally, as I mentioned, the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California at Berkeley has been doing extensive research on positive emotional states in particular, and emotions in general. And during this period of physical distancing, they're also doing a whole series of live events online. So if you have a look at their Facebook page, I believe that is where they've been doing the greatest amount of their live webinars. So I would really encourage you to go and check them out as well. So I'm slowly going to wrap up there. I want to again thank Made of Millions for hosting me here on their YouTube channel. Like I mentioned before, we are now in the month of May, Mental Health Awareness Month. And since Made of Millions is a mental health advocacy group, they're going to have a lot of really wonderful, very useful content coming out this month. So I would definitely encourage that you go and check that out. If you would like to get in touch with me, sorry, I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming in. If you would like to get in touch with me and get any additional information, you can see the info there. If you're a return viewer, you know that during my first series, I was talking about the fact that I wasn't on Instagram, and that was a very kind of intentional decision. I have since joined Instagram, and so you can find me there as well. But you can also just email me directly, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. There's one question here about overcoming intrusive thoughts. And the field of positive psychology, again, because it doesn't deal so much with mental health disorders in that sense, doesn't have a kind of ready-made, prepackaged approach to dealing with things like intrusive thoughts. For those of you who don't know, intrusive thoughts are a component of anxiety, oftentimes of anxiety disorder, and oftentimes obsessive compulsive disorder as well. And so because that question is kind of more in the realm of that clinical field, I think it's probably best that I don't answer it here online. But for the person who asked that question, if you would like to contact me directly, I can maybe get some resources to you and give you some useful information there. So if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you guys all for joining me. The next episode is going to be around the topic of being present. So like I said, this change of focus, or the ability to change your focus, is one of the most important kind of attitude shifts and approaches that the positive psychology field has given us. And so that's what we're going to be talking about next week. And actually, coming to think about it now, speaking of overcoming intrusive thoughts, that may be some elements there that can be helpful when it comes to that as well. So really working on shifting our focus in different directions. In the Buddhist tradition, oftentimes it's referred to as kind of disciplining our mind, or making our mind a little bit more disciplined. So if you're interested in that topic, please be sure to join me next week. It'll be Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern time again. And until then, I hope you have a really good week. Thank you so much.